Well, good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Future Identity North's session on Focus on MDL. We have a really good panel for everyone today, so I'll go ahead and introduce those. We have Loffie Jordaan, a business solutions architect here with the American Association of Motor Vehicle Administrators. We have John Wunderlich, who is an information privacy and security expert and also chair of the Kantara Initiative's Mobile Driving License Ecosystems Discussion Group. We have Eric Jorgensen, the director of the Arizona Department of Motor Vehicles. And we have Gail Hodges, the executive director of the OpenID Foundation, who's also involved in the identity ecosystems, including OpenID Connect and the financial grade API used for open banking. Welcome to all of you, and thank you for joining us today. I want to start our discussion around the standard itself, the 18013 Part 5 standards. I know they've been progressing a while. So, Loffie, could you give us the status of the 18013 Part 5 and what we can expect in the future?
Certainly. Thank you, Mike. Yes, 18013-5 is the standard for an MDL and specifically cover MDL in an attended setting where you have two physical devices that have to communicate with each other to exchange MDL information to be subsequently authenticated by the relying party. So that standard was published in September of 2021. It was preceded by a number of interoperability test events, and we're continuing that test event opportunities for the industry to get used to the standard and build solutions accordingly. And so far, all the feedback we've received was very positive on the standard. So that's as far as 18013-5 is concerned. Did you want me to also cover Part 7?
Yes, please.
Okay, so Part 7 is the follow-up to 18013 Part 5, where Part 5 is looking at the attended case. Part 7 is looking at the unattended case, essentially, in simple language, use of your MDL over the internet. And as far as Part 7 is concerned, as an interesting aside, we are doing this as not an international standard. So it's a technical specification rather than an international standard. And what that means is that the development cycle is much shorter. The top features that we're trying to incorporate into the technical specification is firstly the over the internet protocol, just the communication protocol for exchanging information over the internet as the over the internet version of two devices talking to each other. The other top thing that we're trying to include in Part 7 is on-device holder authentication, where at transaction time, the device will be leveraged so that the relying party can just be informed that the person who is sharing the data is the person to whom the data belongs. So the relying party will not have to make the link between the person and the data. That link will be made by using and leveraging the device. The relying party will just get something that says the person that's sending you the data is the person to whom the data belongs, and the relying party still will have only one trust point. The relying party still only has to trust the issuing authority, who will sign the statement that the data belongs to the person who's presenting it. So we're cautiously optimistic that we'll be able to go out on ballot with Part 7 towards the end of this year.
Thank you, Loffie. And it sounds like the standards are progressing quite well, and the Part 7 over the internet standard is actually going much quicker than possibly had been anticipated. So that's wonderful. Can you talk a little bit about the AAMVA mobile driver license implementation guidelines and how those guidelines compare to the standard, and whether or not it's a document that the relying party should look at?
Certainly. So 18013 Part 5 specifies the communication interface between two devices. Also, if you go with server retrieval, the interface between the relying party and the issuing authority, but primarily for offline use, the interface between two devices. What the AAMVA implementation guidelines now do is to take that, build on it, and provide broader guidance to issuing authorities on how to issue mobile driver licenses. So we took Bot 5, we added a North American namespace, which was allowed by the standard, to add domestic data elements that we use in North America. And then the guidelines go and address quite a few other items that are out of scope of 1813 Part 5. Items such as privacy. Part 5 has an informative annex on privacy. The guidelines expand on that in quite a bit more detail, trying to help guide issuing authorities, telling them what a privacy-preserving MDL implementation looks like, because privacy by design is very important in the MDL environment. Other topics covered in the MDL guidelines include the trust model. Again, in the ISO standard, there is a solution. In the guidelines, we firm that up to make sure that we have something that's actually working and operational, so issuing authorities can use it. We talk about how often MDL data should be refreshed on a device. The guidelines talk about how to think about and policy matters to consider in respect of multiple credentials. Should I allow a person to have more than one MDL? How should an issuing authority view devices that are shared between individuals? The guidelines talk about flash pass use, or rather not to use MDLs or allow MDLs to use in a flash pass scenario. We talk about what to do if an issuing authority would like to revoke an MDL issued by a different issuing authority, which happens in the case of the physical license today. So what does that look like in the world of the MDL? And then it goes a little bit into provisioning, giving guidance on that, recognizing that standards for provisioning are separately being developed in ISO, in SC17WG4, and that as those standards mature, we expect to incorporate that guidance into the MDL guidelines. Which brings me to the last point, which is that the MDL guidelines are a living set of instructions or guidance. And so it's continually being updated. And as things progress, we will continue to bring out new versions.
Thank you for that. And just in case our audience isn't aware of what flash pass means, could you elaborate just a little bit on that?
So flash pass use is where I use my device and I show something to someone else. I show them something that looks like a driver's license and they accept it on face value. So there's no authentication of the information. There's just the right party looking at information and saying, yes, I believe the information being shown to me because I can see it. And we believe that that is a very dangerous approach, and we strongly recommend that never be followed by any issuing authority.
Thank you. That's very helpful. John, I want to kick it over to you for just a second. Privacy and security were foundations used in the development of the standard and the implementation guidelines that Loffie was just describing. How does the standard address the privacy foundations for the holder? Can you speak to that?
Sure, I can talk about that in two facets. Within the scope and competence of 18013, which is to say about the data flows and interactions and the interfaces between the issuer, the holder, and the relying party or the verifier. And those are technical and transactional, and they do a lot of good things for building privacy and ensuring, and again, as Loffie pointed out, this is for the in-person presentation. So making sure that the presentation ritual itself is discretionary. It's not mandatory, so that you have this element of consent. The notion of minimal data disclosure. So if you're looking for age verification, the possibility of providing just month and day of year, or just, am I old enough to qualify to buy cannabis? Sorry, Canadian speaking. Or whatever the deal is, as opposed to the physical presentation where where all of the data that's on the card is available to be harvested if the individual reviewing the card for admission to the store or the club or whatever is a bad actor. So at that level, a lot of it is addressed. But if I put on my hat as a privacy person or as an enterprise privacy consultant, some of the stuff that's scoped out of 18013-5, and Loffie will correct me if I'm wrong, have to do with governance, policy, and things outside the transaction. So we talk in privacy about privacy impact assessments or privacy policies, privacy programs. So if the minimum data happens to include the holder's address, what assurances does the holder have? And 18013 doesn't make these assurances, not because of the nature of the program, that address or that email address will only be used, for example, for communicating warranty information. There's a use case where you buy something online and you use your mobile credential or driver license to pick it up in the store. And it's possible you need to provide your email in that case. And the only reason you need the email is for the notification of the collection, or maybe it's retained for warranty purposes on the item. If it turns out to be used for marketing, there's nothing in 18013 to prevent that downstream secondary use of that data for what might be a privacy violating assurance. That's the Kantara work group is working, and it's just in its formative stages, but it's working to build those governance and policy and sort of broader scope privacy protections so that not only can Alice, if we use the Alice and Bob metaphor, trust the transactional nature of the 18013-5 credential, but can trust the verifying party or the relying party that Canadian Tire, to pick an example, is not going to abuse the information that's collected through a legitimate 18013-5 transaction.
Thank you, John. And so for the protections outside of the standard, once you release the data as the holder to the relying party, are there things in your mind that can be done, such as governance policy decisions or legal decisions that would be made that could help at least administer some of those concerns?
Absolutely. I mean, that's part of the reason that Gail and I are here in Berlin at an identity conference. The European data protection law, to a lesser extent, the Canadian data protection law, provides some level of assurance for those organizations that they've done things like a data protection impact assessment or a privacy impact assessment as part of adopting a new technology, that they have a privacy program in place. Loffie talked about privacy by design, which is a way of building software. Try not to build. I participate in another work group over in the IEEE, which is for software developers, which has just released a standard for implementing privacy into software development life cycles, and so forth and so on. So there's both at the process level for developers or for systems, and at the governance level of policy for an organization, ways to build privacy protections in. No system's perfect, so those will typically involve breach management or security incident management that, depending on the jurisdiction, will require notification to the individuals whose data has been breached. Because no system's perfect, right?
True, very true. Are there any other things inside of the Kantara initiative that you haven't talked about yet that you think would be something that the listeners could get value from for the MDL holder and the privacy for them?
No, it's early days yet. The best way they can get value out is by participating and joining the work group, so they get to. We're just in the final stages of wrapping up an initial report, which is just sort of high level. We're flying in this direction if you're an implementer, to know that if you want to get certified against this when the requirements are released. But we haven't yet defined all the requirements, and if you're in a space or an organization who would like to contribute to those requirements, we'd love to have you on board. I mean, AAMVA's been a great participant in that, for example, as is OIDC and Future Identity Council.
Absolutely. Thank you. So Eric, over to you, sir. How do you see jurisdictions actively pursuing the MDL solutions? Do you see them going after them?
The short answer is yes, right? I think that we're definitely, Arizona's already actively pursuing it, and my discussion with other states and within the AAMVA community, within other jurisdictions and Canadian jurisdictions included, this is definitely something that we're all working towards. I think that there's often a concern, right, about how quickly will this happen? Will it happen fast enough? And honestly, it's a concern for me too, to say, how do we make sure that we're providing value in a timely way? And you get to kind of this chicken and the egg scenario where I want to provide you a service, but if there's no place to use it, then what's the value in me providing it? And nobody wants to develop something if there's nobody providing it as a service on the other end. So if no state is issuing and no reliant party is accepting, that becomes problematic. And that is where I think a lot of the initiatives that we've had start to launch recently. The Apple pilot with the TSA, for example, for boarding an aircraft here in the United States, has been a good way to start moving that conversation forward. But I think in the end, as much as there are use cases out there, we as states need it ourselves, right? And that was actually where Arizona started with. It was a realization that, especially for that 18013-7, that unattended use case, it opens a lot of doors to us in delivering modern government services in a modern way that didn't exist without some way to really authenticate and know our customer. So I think that's another big push that we as issuing authorities, jurisdictions, states, and provinces have to move us forward on that.
Thank you. And so we know that across North America, I don't know that there's any jurisdiction that isn't looking in some manner at a digital solution for an MDL solution. And in doing that, some of them have already implemented, like you guys have already implemented, other states have already implemented. Some are implementing now. Some are doing it with the Apple solution. Some are doing it one-off solutions for their own within their states, but they're MDL 18013 compliant. And so as these states come on, they're having to do something. They're having to get the relying parties their public keys. And as the chair of the AAMVA Digital Trust Service Steering Committee, how do you see that Digital Trust Service Steering Committee helping getting those public keys out into the relying parties' hands?
Well, I think there's a couple of benefits that come from the DTS project. One is simply that there is one place to go get the key, right? And that makes a big difference when you're thinking about, if you're looking at United States and Canada, 69 jurisdictions, and if you have to go to each jurisdiction, find the key, make sure that you've authenticated it as it comes down to you've got the right key, you did go to the right place. That's an administrative burden that we'd like to avoid. So having one place, having a digital trust service, one place where you can go and grab all of these keys is just administratively easier. At the same time, and I think it may be a more powerful aspect of that, is understanding what it takes for a jurisdiction to be in the digital trust service. The agreement that we have amongst ourselves, and we're in the process of building this and these requirements at this point, to say, if you get a key from the digital trust service, this is what you can expect from the jurisdictions that are participating. So, as we've had early discussions, things that are important include being 18013 compliant, right? To be able to say, if I go here and get that key, this is going to be a compliant implementation. Some of the privacy things that were spoken about earlier, what of those need to be implemented? What in the AAMVA guidelines need to be implemented, so that there is that trust, not only trust that the key was correct and that this key unlocks the MDL for the verifier, but trust that jurisdictions are operating in a consistent manner with the standards that have been set.
Wonderful. And your state, Arizona, was the first state to implement the Apple Wallet solution. and there's a lot of buzz and discussion around that solution itself. Can you tell us a little bit about how that's going, how it went? I know it's successful, but how well that's going in your state?
Sure. So it's actually our second MDL implementation. We about a year earlier had implemented an app-based MDL, and the biggest user of that, the biggest verifying reliant party of that implementation, the pre-Apple implementation, was actually us. We use it to verify customers ourselves. Now that's prior to the 18013-7 standard, so we're operating a little bit in uncharted waters, but that has gone really well for us. The Apple implementation came in March, and it went amazingly smoothly for us, right? Which is not something I get to say all the time. Having done big modernization projects, I know that things are never easy, but one measure of success for us was we shut down our war room on the second day. So by day 2, we felt that we had worked through enough of the bugs that we could shut down our war room rapid response teams and go into a normal operating feature. Right now we have about we're coming up on 70,000 Apple in ID and Apple wallets. So about 70,000 people. It is a pretty limited use case at the moment, and intentionally so. Right now it's used at TSA checkpoints in the Phoenix Sky Harbor Airport, and only select checkpoints there at the moment, though that continues to expand. We have found that, as you're going through this process, there is a provisioning ritual that you go through, right? Where you are scanning or taking a picture of the front and back of the car, taking a selfie. There's a whole bunch of information that gets collected that way, sent to us for us to review, to score, to make some assurance that they're right. And then if we say, yeah, everything looks good, we provision. If we say this is definitely bad, we don't. And if we need more information, if we just don't have quite enough, we do have a way to reach out to you. We've been able to do that so that better than 90% of those can be resolved online. So it's a fairly fluid, simple process for provisioning. And in the airport, been able to have some people use it through the airport, and it is a very fast process. So overall, I think it's been a very successful implementation, and looking forward to seeing it continue to expand.
And I think the takeaway from that is the knowledge that even though it's in the Apple wallet, the state is still the signator of the data that goes into the wallet. The state is still the responsible party, has signed the data as it's accurate, and it's the state that's still in control of putting that data or signing that data that is actually put into the wallet. So Apple's not the signator. It is Arizona in this case. Wonderful. Thank you. Gail, certainly want to hear from you. We've talked a lot about the guidelines and the standards and the user control and data minimization, but want to talk a little bit about how the MDL, as it's defined in 18013, could be leveraged by relying party networks to be used.
Absolutely, and also happy to applaud all the work of this group in your efforts to support different parts of the digital identity ecosystem. It's been many years of hard work. So I think Eric mentioned clearly one of the champion use cases from a US market perspective, to have that TSA acceptance and have that rolling out nationally across the US over the course of the next 2 years will be a meaningful use case for many Americans who fly, to be able to take advantage of that. And I think it's great work, the Administrator Pekoski for the TSA, and the specific team members there like Melissa Connolly and Jason Lim, what they've done to realize the potential of that use case. But that's in a way one of the easier use cases. They might not fully agree that it's easy, but rolling out only a couple thousand terminals across those different airports is a very discrete kind of geographic challenge, and a single relying party to enable those potentially millions of Americans to go through checkpoints and assert their Arizona or other state credentials. When you start to look at other types of use cases for relying parties, let's take the really big and the really small. So a really big, like a Walmart, to try and get coverage of all the Walmarts across America so that they could accept a driving license for, let's say, purchase of alcohol, or to capture information for a rewards program, or to link it into their payment application. There's a lot of richness and complexity for them being able to do that. And it could go through the same rails, if you will, of payment transactions, but that's incorporating it into a pretty complicated payment ecosystem with acquirers, with the physical terminals in those locations and so forth. Then you can go to the really small kind of mom and pop environment where you can have a doorman with an app on his device, which can read that credential using the 18013-5 standard. And that app could be something that's generally available. It could even be a free app that allows you from device to device to exchange that information. So that could roll out quite swiftly. And then we might also be seeing some of the let's say small mom and pop merchant transaction providers like a Square being able to upgrade and have unique pucks that would be able to accept a mobile driving license credential. And then that could roll out very quickly. But it's a lot of ifs, ands, and buts in terms of which of those are going to move first, second, and third. I, for one, am very intrigued and interested and keen to stimulate the relying party community to roll out those different types of models and to explore the different ones that will be meaningful. It is obviously a concern, I think, of everyone in the ecosystem that there isn't within the 18013-5 any strict constraints on the data that can be presented. What John and the working group in Kantara is focused on is such important work, because the burden right now, just like in most internet transactions today, is putting the burden on the user that they decide to release information. And if they decide to release information to an entity that isn't yet authenticated, so a doorman who's going to kind of take a bunch of addresses from a lot of pretty girls and then take it back and like stalk them to their rooms, is a very scary kind of use case, but it's a real possibility, right? That something bad can happen with the information that's collected through these journeys. There's also, as we move into an environment of 18013-7 and online transactions, that one can kind of have premeditated discrimination. So, for example, do you deliver the pizza to the person who has a headscarf in their picture? Do you see, oh, it's a pretty girl in the dorm room I'm delivering that pizza to? Or in the case of, let's say, a financial services transaction, it can get to the point of an AI algorithm consuming all the information off of that mobile driving license credential and deciding that based on someone's height and weight 5 years ago, that they're a high risk and maybe they shouldn't receive a loan or a credit card or a personal loan. So there are some real risks. And I think as a community, there's a collective acknowledgement of those privacy challenges and the challenges to adopt existing infrastructure to roll out the acceptance of that. But the upside, the potential for this technology is really quite profound. And I think that's a lot of what we're seeing here in the European Identity and Cloud Conference, is that having a government-issued credential from the state of Arizona, from different states in the US, from actually the EU digital wallet and the EIDAS-2 initiative here in Europe, and many countries around the world, governments are truly grappling with what good looks like and how to enable identity infrastructure, not just for their own domestic government acceptance use cases. What Eric mentioned is that first use case was how can you eat your own dog food, right? To create a credential and then to consume it within your operation. But how can you create credentials in a way that really help serve your people in their everyday lives, right? Help them open those bank accounts, help them assert their identity to get the marijuana or the beer or whatever the case is. Because in our society today, there's structural friction in how people assert who they are. And that friction literally limits GDP growth, right? Because I can't get access to my credit, so I can't buy the thing I need or the house I want. And all that friction along the way adds up to be, in a way, a tax on our society. And it's partly because there are so many bad actors trying to grab the information from people or grab their assets. And so what government has this wonderful opportunity to do is to use this great emerging standards like 18013-5 and government issued credentials that can be released online and in person to build out far more robust identity infrastructure than what we have today. So to me, the sky is the limit in terms of what these kinds of credentials can do. And all of these initial use cases that we're just starting to see build out is the very beginning of an exciting and very long journey.
Although I'll just note the difference between what they could do, and what they should do is it will be an ongoing debate in civil society and with organizations like Eric's and Mike.
So excellent points, and we know that anything new that starts small and starts with narrow focus on the implementations of those and in this case credentials. And this is a question for the group. Where do you think then? How do you think this is going to progress in the sense of the next use cases, or even the next things that these credentials can be used for? In John's note, should be and could be, understanding those are two potentially different things. But where do you guys see the MDL going in the next 12 months? And anybody can start.
I'll start unless anyone else wants to. I think one of the areas, not only will we see more U.S. states starting to issue credentials, as Eric mentioned, I think there's kind of a robust pipeline that's been messaged from Apple. There's obviously other digital platforms that have been active in the mobile driving license community. So I would expect to see Google taking some action here because of their public work on the standard. Maybe others like Samsung, kind of see similar characters involved in payments are probably likely to come into the identity sphere. And there could be other providers as well. But the list there could get very long. You could have crypto wallets saying, Eric, I want you to bless my crypto wallet, please, and issue your credential. So I think states will probably find themselves needing to be quite thoughtful in how do they develop the program to even evaluate which types of wallet partners they might seek to enable. So that's one whole kind of area of growth, Mike, that we'll see some movement. And then, of course, I think the relying party side will probably start to see those little small apps that would be able to do app-to-app exchange of information, because those could be released. But maybe we'll see there's also some throttles, some need for terminal authentication, and to have a high level of trust on who the counterparty is in a given transaction. So I certainly would like to see more progress there on terminal authentication to help address, confidence to the user that it's real, it's a real counterparty in a transaction.
Yeah, if I knew the answer to that question, Mike, I'd be a rich VC right now, I tell you. I think there's a lot of branching paths. I mean, just think about credentials. What is this, May of 2022? So you think about COVID credentials, like My Data which is an NGO based out of Europe, had an active COVID credentials work group. And what's the appropriate one for that? KYC and fintech continues to be an ongoing challenge, and just the basic use case of age verification. If somebody comes up with a viable, reasonable friction, because I don't think it should be friction-free. I think it should. People who want to divulge their information about themselves will feel disrespected, in my opinion, if it's friction-free. It's as, how am I getting in? What are they taking if this is invisible, right? So trying to figure out the UX for a reasonable and reassuring amount of friction in the transaction is going to be a wicked hard problem. But if you get that right, if that starts to work in the clubs and the dormant, that's the thin edge of the wedge. So I'm not sure whether it'll be KYC, door people, COVID credentials, or travel. One of those is likely to be where the action is. But which one comes first? Who can say? There's a UX. There's a serious UX problem with both onboarding keys, managing key rotation, and updating keys. So that would be like a grand challenge in identity.
And I think both of those are good points there. And I would expect that in the next little bit we start to see a snowball effect, right? I'm glad to be out and having it out there, even if there are only a few use cases, because I think it stimulates this conversation. And that's really what needs to happen next, is that we need to, I think there's things that we don't even think about yet, that there's the problems that we're going to have to solve. And until we're out there finding them, we don't even know to have the discussion. And that's the trend that I've been seeing with the other jurisdictions in our conversations, is this increasing realization that there are tough questions that we're going to have to answer, and we're going to have to do it fairly quickly, because there's going to be a quick and growing demand for this type of verification and authentication of whoever's on the other end of that credential.
Now, I say this often, but I believe it's Bill Gates who said we overestimate what's going to happen in the next 2 years, the short term, and we underestimate what's going to happen, the next 10 years, the long term. And so I'm trying to stand back, asking myself, what's this going to look like 5 years even from now? What are the things that could potentially be, flap of a butterfly's wings now that's going to have a big change later on? And it's almost impossible to do that, but it's still fun to try and think, thought experiments. What is it? Because we know what the immediate challenges are, but we don't have a good grasp of how this is eventually going to evolve. And trying to get ahead of that, I think, is a very nice challenge.
Yeah, the example that I sometimes think of, the dystopian one, is from the Philip K. Minority Report, watching Tom Cruise walk through the wall, and based on facial recognition or iris recognition, getting bombarded with holographic ads as he walked through the mall. It says, there's a future we don't want.
Well, folks, yeah. Well, thank you for today. I think the takeaways from this are that we are on the verge of creating something that is safer for the users, more reliable for the relying parties in the transactional space. There's a lot of questions to be answered. The standard is evergreen. We've published the first part. We're working on publishing the second part, and even those publications, as we learn and as we grow, will actually be updated. Thank you all, Loffie, John, Gail, Eric, for your input today. And I did neglect I think the audience may be wondering who I am. I am Michael McCaskill, the Director of Identity Management at the American Association of Motor Vehicle Administrators. My apologies for waiting this long, but the more important folks were the ones that were speaking today to you. We want to thank you for joining us today, and we hope you have a good rest of your conference.